I I hope you are all well in your different locations and regions and communities. Today we are going to focus on the SDGs and health. Right to development and health in the SDGs. We will try to follow the same format as the webinar we had last week. In terms of having identifying some of the synergies in the right to development and the health SDG, which is mainly in SDG 3. In terms of the format, I tried to do this in about 15 minutes. As always, there are so many complex policy issues to explore. But I try to highlight the most important things, and so that we can have some quality time for discussion and comments at the end. So I will try to do this in about 15 minutes or maximum an hour, and devote maybe 15 to 20 minutes for comments and questions. So we try to understand the scope and content of the right to the highest attainable standard of health, which is the formula that you find in most international human rights instruments dealing with health, whether it's the International Covenants on Socio-Economic and Cultural Rights, or the WHO Constitution itself, which refers or codifies the right to the highest attainable standard of health. Then we proceed to analyze the goals and targets in Agenda 2030 related to health, the target specifically on SDG 3 on health and well-being. Then we will try to understand how operationalizing the right to development can facilitate the implementation of the goals and targets related to health in the SDGs. Like I said, I will take about 15 minutes to an hour to do this. Give a basic overview, like we did last week, of the synergies between the right to development and the right to health and the health and well-being for all, which is provided in SDG 3. We will, as we did last week, look at the people-centered paradigms, both in on the right to development and the right to health. And we'll look at the indivisibility and the interdependence of all rights. And then we begin to unpack, the health and well-being targets in SDG 3. So we have about, we target to have about 10 to 20 minutes at the end to have a discussion. In terms of the synergies, I think we covered this last week, and I'm sure that my colleague, Dr. Kanade, must have also covered this in your first week. The Declaration on the Right to Development makes this very clear provision on development being an inalienable human right, by virtue of which every human person and all people, will have to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy the socio-economic and cultural and political development in which all human rights and fundamental freedoms are fully realized. So this is a very powerful codification of the centrality of the human person in the right to development, and also the interdependence of all rights. And you see, in terms of trying to draw the synergies and linkages, if you look at the WHO Constitution, which we are going to talk about a couple of times in this webinar, you find also a very similar codification. The WHO Constitution provides that the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health is one of the fundamental rights of every human being, without distinction of race, religion, political belief, economic or social condition. So you can as well just look at the preambles of these two important documents the WHO Constitution and the Declaration on the Right to Development. And you can see this synergy right away. In the for some of you who come from, who have very strong backgrounds in international human rights, and I'm sure some of you do, in the 70s and 80s, the right to development was frequently invoked as part of the so-called third generation rights. So solidarity, collective, or people's rights. And I will explain what all of this mean for some of you who don't have that background. It was recognized as an inalienable human rights, the anchor and pillars for the enjoyment of economic, social, cultural, and political development. Okay, and on these pillars rest the full realization of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. So development is the process, okay, that I'm sure if you put 20 scholars or 20 students of development in a room and ask them what does development mean, they're going to come up with different definitions and perspectives based on their backgrounds. But for purposes of our discussion today, development is the process that improves the economic, social, and social circumstances of every human being. If you look at the WHO Constitution again, you'll find a definition of health that is very, very, not just ambitious, but also which places health in the context of socioeconomic development. So health is not just the absence of a disease or infirmity, but a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. Okay, so that you see very strongly written. That's the most popular definition of health that you will, if you do any studies on health, that's that this definition will come up. And what that means is that health goes beyond what happens in hospitals or what the relationship between a patient and the physician and the doctor. That's very important because when you get sick, you have to consult a doctor. There's a diagnosis, there's a prescription, or there has to be a form of healing that follows that. But in the context of the discussion on the right to development or health in the SDGs, health actually goes beyond that, beyond disease or malfunction of the body. So it's a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. And the important thing about this definition, which actually is now older, more than 70 years, the WHO Constitution was adopted in 1946. So you can imagine, just 1 year after the UN was established. So for you to, if you want to use this definition in the WHO Constitution, it aligns very well with, the work of some of the popular economists like Nobel laureate, the Indian economist Amartya Sen, his work on development as freedom, for instance. Because all too often, last week I was telling you about, how the economic growth measured by GDP, gross domestic product, doesn't give us the full picture of development. Okay, so we have to move towards the concept of human development in order to have a full integrated perspectives on development issues. So this historical dichotomy that I talked about between civil and political rights, the so-called first generation rights, and socioeconomic and cultural rights, the so-called second generation rights, and group rights, the so-called third generation rights. Now, for some of you who come from very strong international human rights background, this is very easy to understand. But for some of our colleagues who don't have that kind of background, I call it a historical dichotomy because if you look at at least international, Bill of Rights and all the discourse and activism of the 60s and of the 70s. First and foremost, it was thought that civil and political rights, rooted in Western philosophical thoughts. These are human rights just means where there's an entitlement which is inheres in a person. Which inheres in a person. And if there's a violation of that particular entitlement, it triggers the automatic redress, against the state. So, for instance, if I'm locked up without trial, or if somebody denies me the freedom of association, or the right to vote in an election, all of these are all civil and political rights. And because there's a very strong, element of the so-called justiciability, that if there's a violation, there's a redress, there's a compensation, either through the court or tribunal or so that's actually it's rooted in Western philosophical thoughts of the social contract theories and all of that. Socioeconomic and cultural rights. In the 70s, all of these things about right to food, right to education, right to health, they all emerged, and then because of the fact that, in so many societies, these economic, cultural, and social rights are not justiciable. You can't go to court to, in any country and say, I have the freedom to, to education. Okay, for instance, I have a right to food. Okay, I have, if I'm sick, I have to be provided, the healthcare that I need. So it created a form of tension between, the civil and political rights and these economic and social and cultural rights. So one of the distinguishing factors is that these are not justiciable. These, in so many domestic constitutions, even if they are provided, with exceptions like the South African Constitution and the few others, even if they are provided in the Constitution, they are there as, what is called, what's the formulation? It's called, so these are like socially progressive, ideas, that the state has to aspire to, but, short of, conferring them the full, toga of the sustainable rights. Another way to look at it also is that in the 60s and 70s, most of the socialist constitutions of the world, socialist countries, were pushing for economic, social, and cultural rights because they thought that was actually, as equally as important as civil and political rights, that is rooted in, deeply in Western philosophical thoughts. And then we throw into this mix the so-called group or solidarity rights, which was also very heavily debated. The fact that human rights here in a person, not in a group, but we have human rights treaties that protect groups like the rights on UN Convention on Rights of the Child, disabled people, indigenous groups, women. These are all identifiable groups. But for instance, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights was the most progressive regional human rights instrument that actually elevated people's rights to the pedestal of enforceable rights. And there are so many provisions in the African Charter, for instance, that talks about all peoples having a right to certain things. So this dichotomy should not basically distract us, but I think we can work with them, in terms of the perspective of indivisibility and interdependence of rights. And this is something that comes out very strongly if you look at the UN, some of the literature from the UN human rights instruments, going back to the Vienna Declaration and all of that, reaffirming very strongly that all human rights are interdependent and indivisible. So I wouldn't waste too much time on this, but I wanted to explain this just for some of us who don't have backgrounds in international human rights. There's now a lot of literature that looks at this so-called justiciability factor. So it's not just the fact that economic, social, and cultural rights are largely non-justiciable. There's now a move, towards using different, different modes, to confer justiciability on those. If you look at, for instance, what has happened in India, in the past, I would say, past, getting back about 20 years now, where the Supreme Court of India has used the civil and political rights as a route, to give life, to these socioeconomic and cultural rights, including the right to health. Okay, so what is right to life? If people, get sick and they can get treatment that is available. Okay, so those are the kinds of, activism that you see in those coming from different jurisdictions. So let us not, I know this question will come up maybe during at the end of the webinar. Let's not over celebrate, this concept of accessibility, because there are so many ways that actually they've been circumvented when giving muzzles, to the socioeconomic and cultural rights. Article 9 of the Right to Development Declaration provides that all the aspects of the right to development set forth in the present declaration are indivisible and interdependent. Okay, so you see that concept that we should look at them as a coherent, whole, not as independent pieces of a puzzle. And again, like we said last week, it places the human person as the central subject. You have to be an active participant and ultimate beneficiary as much as possible. So there are, as we know, there are 17 sustainable, 17 SDGs and 169 targets. So if you put this 17 SDGs, ranging from poverty to education, to gender, to health, they all have totally, 169 targets. So you can see the challenges that countries face, between now and 2030, to be able to meet some of these targets. And the negotiations were long and tortuous. Sometimes we blame the UN, or we blame this kind of international, declarations as being too vague. But if you've been in a typical UN negotiation, these things take a lot of time. It's a long, tortuous, and nerve-wracking process involving a compromise between 195, member states, ranging from the rich industrialized states to the least, developed. There has to be a form of consensus, to have an agreement. And the SDGs are driven by the 5 big transformative shifts. The major one is, leaving no one behind, which has been the underpinning philosophical pillar for the entire 17 goals. Health is primarily anchored on goal 3. Ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. And if you begin to unpack this, in the context of what we now know as the definition of health, not just the absence of disease or infirmity. The goal 3, the health SDG, has 13 targets, and I think is actually the goal that has the highest number of targets. Okay, in the entire the 17 goals. And it ranges from a whole lot of things. And this is where, if you do an unpacking, you have to understand that it's not just, it sounds as easy to ensure healthy lives and promote, well-being for all at all ages. But when you unpack the 13 targets, it ranges from things like reducing maternal mortality, which we know is still a big issue, in so many, in most developing regions of the world. Infant mortality as well, ending preventable mortality of newborns, ending the epidemics of HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and neglected tropical diseases, reducing premature mortality from non-communicable diseases, things like respiratory infections, cancers, stroke, all of these, diabetes. These are the non-communicable diseases that have become the leading killers now, in so many different regions. Strengthening the prevention and treatment of substance abuse, including narcotic drug use and harmful use of alcohol. cutting in half the number of injuries from road traffic accidents. Another very serious health issue that we don't normally think about. But when we talk about health, we think about what happens in the healthcare setting. But if you look at the number of people that are injured every 24 hours across the world in road traffic accidents, you understand how this has become a very big global health issue. Ensuring universal access to sexual and reproductive health services, achieving universal health coverage, reducing the deaths and illness from air, water, and soil pollution, tobacco control, which is a major risk factor in cancers and non-communicable diseases, supporting research and development of vaccine and medicines for communicable and non-communicable diseases, including access to affordable essential medicines for all. We've seen this play out, for instance, during the pandemic, vaccine equity around the world, access to vaccines between the rich and the poor countries. Increased health financing, development and training, and retention of health workforce in developing countries. Very big issue where doctors always migrate, from developing countries to the industrialized countries in search of opportunities. The strengthening of capacity for all countries for early warning, risk reduction, and management of national and global health risks. So this, again, rings a bell. That's why I highlighted it in the context of what we've lived with, in the past 2 years, 2.5 years because of COVID. So how all countries should, strengthen their capacity for early warning and the risk reduction for emerging and reimagine global health risks. So if you look at these 13 targets, and do each of them raises very complicated, complex, issues, ranging from financial resources to planning to, health equity and health system strengthening in so many countries. So you can imagine, what every country really, is struggling, to achieve in terms of the SDG 3 between now and 2030. Okay, so the SDGs, just like the right to development, are interlinked, interdependent, holistic, integrated, as a package. You can think of, there are so many ways to think about these interlinkages, just like we can think about linkages in, of civil and political rights and socioeconomic and cultural rights. For instance, Goal 3 that we've looked at, Goal 3 on health is meaningless, for instance, without Goal 2. Okay, Goal 2 is ending hunger and achieving food security. If you don't eat nutritious meal, it affects your health. Okay, so that's the linkage. It's very easy to see the linkage. When people are, when children are malnourished, for instance, when they don't eat nutritious meal, it leads to all sorts of health issues. So you cannot discuss SDG 3 without discussing SDG 2 as well. So this is just one example. Goal 4, for instance, inclusive, equitable, quality education and promotion of lifelong opportunities for all. So think about what happens when children, in nursery or elementary school, if they are too sick or hungry to attend school, of course, it affects the quality of education, the quality of learning that they receive. So Goal 3 on health, Goal 2 on hunger, cannot be decoupled from Goal 4, of inclusive, equitable, quality education for, and opportunities for all. If you look at Goal 11 on building inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable cities and human settlements, it raises serious health issues, for people that live in urban slums and informal settlements in cities globally, ranging from, it's from Rio de Janeiro to Accra in Ghana, to Lagos in Nigeria, to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. You have all of these, posh, neighborhoods. But, you just step 2-3 kilometers away, you see urban slums and informal settlements. And the so-called urban poor that live in these settlements, they don't have access to healthcare. Okay, they're poor, they're hungry, they don't have access to food. So you might think about Goal 11 as, oh, it's about cities, sustainable cities, and human settlement, but it raises health issues, okay, as well. So if you actually do some form of impact analysis, I will show you there's a wheel. If you put the health at the center of the entire SDG, the 16 goals, it actually affects every single thing, every single of the other goals. The same thing, if you take health out of that and put poverty at the center, it affects every other thing, every other. So we have to look at this as an indivisible and interdependent package. And this is actually the lesson that the right to development actually, gives us, when we analyze health and SDGs. So the legacy of SDG 3, it has been argued, by so many scholars and practitioners, lies in the possibility that the ambition of the global goals reaches far beyond rolling out universal healthcare, for instance. But it's one that gives impetus to action on a range of social determinants of health. So this is actually where that definition of WHO comes very handy, okay? So this is not just about just universal health coverage, but if you look at those 13 targets, the SDG gives us an impetus, to action on a range of, socioeconomic determinants of health. And if you go back in history a bit, if you look at the developments that have followed international health or global health since the WHO Constitution of 1946, you find, for instance, the WHO and UNICEF Declaration of Alma Ata, the Alma Ata Declaration on Primary Health Care, 1978, the Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion, 1986, the various reports. There are two important commissions by the WHO, the Commission on Social Determinants of Health, which was in 2008, the Commission on Macroeconomics and Health in 2001, that was chaired by the Sachs. All of these, one thing that runs, runs through, one common feature that runs through all of these commitments is the fact that health should never be confined to the biomedical sphere. Okay, so you need to put it in the context of socioeconomic development. And all of these reports I've highlighted from the WHO Constitution of 1946, the WHO UNICEF Alma Ata Declaration on Primary Health Care, 1978, the Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion, and those reports on social determinants of health and the Commission on Macroeconomics and Health, all of them make the same points, okay? That we need to elevate, health at the pedestal of socioeconomic development. Okay, so this is the wheel I talked about. We call it the health in SDG wheel. So these are if you put health at the center, then the other 16 goals are in a circle, and we find that there's a connection. I've given you some of the examples, with children, for instance, on the education goal. If they're too sick because they don't eat nutritious meals, then it's a health issue. If you're designing a city and you want to, working towards, the city of Lagos in Nigeria, for instance, if it's being remodeled, I don't think about the rights of disabled people. We don't think about what happens in informal slums. Is a health issue. Okay, so we can do that kind of health impact analysis. And like I said, it's not just about health. If you take out health from the middle and put another SDG there, you get the same results. Okay, so that's a very beautiful way of understanding these interlinkages and the interdependence of the SDGs. Okay, so so if you look at those 169 targets spread across the entire 17 goals, you have this this interdependence, but also there's a call, to cooperate internationally. Okay. One thing about the beauty of the SDGs is that no one country alone. This is not like the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, which was a package mainly for developing countries. If you look at the SDGs, the beauty is that no country alone, no matter how industrialized, will be able to, to achieve this 169 targets between now and 2030. So that's the beauty of it. So it calls for international cooperation. Okay, the same thing that the right to development does. That's the duty to cooperate internationally to to achieve the declaration of the right to development. So if you look at SDG 17, it talks about revitalizing global partnerships for sustainable development. Okay, so there are so many ways to do that. We looked at climate change last week, and we saw, the steps being taken, to address, fossil fuels, for instance. That's international cooperation, because no single country, no matter how powerful, no matter how wealthy, no matter how industrialized, can address climate change alone. And we talked about those, common but differentiated responsibilities. There's a role to be played by the major industrialized countries who are the main emitters of greenhouse gases, but also there's no free rider. Okay, developing countries also have to play their own part. So if you want to look at adopting the same framework, the 17 goals and the 169 targets of the entire SDG, raises, there's a call for action to revitalize global partnerships, for sustainable development. So implementing the SDGs requires, as we all know, effective and innovative accountability mechanisms. One of the things that actually comes up, in all of this, if you look at those 13 targets on health, you find that there's a heavy influence of businesses and corporations. Okay, if you talk about tobacco control, tobacco is a major risk factor in non-communicable diseases, especially smoking and lung cancers. Lung cancers. Then how do you regulate tobacco, for instance? It's a business. The major tobacco companies are very influential, powerful, rich multinationals that can thwart any regulatory procedures in most developing countries. So this is one example. The food industry is very, 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 influential. The alcohol industry, you see something there about harmful use of alcohol. That's one of the, to reduce, harmful use of alcohol. So if you want to regulate the food, tobacco, alcohol industry, for instance, these are businesses, these are corporations, and they have money. They can thwart, government regulatory procedures. Okay, so so one thing I want to talk about, because like I said, when we do the unpacking, we can see, how difficult it is for so many countries, especially developing countries. One of the first things, for instance, you see that comes up whenever you talk about health is patents, pharmaceutical patents, intellectual property protection that is held by multinational corporations. And these things often tend to keep the prices of essential medicines artificially high for the poor and vulnerable groups who are in most need of these drugs. Okay, we saw that during COVID, vaccines that were produced were not, easily available in the first 6 months, of when they were certified, as good for use for COVID. But beyond that, we saw this during the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic as well. How antiretroviral drugs, are kept artificially high because of patents, because of intellectual property rights of the big pharmaceuticals, Pfizer, all of those, pharmaceutical companies. And people are dying. Okay, now there are so many drugs for cancer. There are so many drugs for all kinds of treatments that are not available in most developing countries. Why? Because of pharmaceutical patents that are held by these powerful multinational corporations. There could also be questions about the liability of the private actors. Say, for instance, if you are licensed to operate a nuclear plant, it's an example, that sometimes we don't think about because, we come from countries that don't have nuclear plants. But think about what happened in Japan, for instance, the Fukushima disaster, the nuclear accident that was caused by the tsunami. Just a natural hazard like a tsunami happens, and then there's an earthquake, it triggers an earthquake, and earthquake triggers, a damage to the nuclear plants. These things are run by, private actors. So at that point, when the nuclear plant is damaged, it leads to serious environmental degradation. It leads to also serious danger and hazard to health, because of the emission and radiation issues. So in situations like that, the state, has an obligation to regulate, that business or that multinational corporation, whether it's for patents or for nuclear plants, or, like I said, the regulating tobacco, alcohol, food, unsafe food, and all of this. So one way to do that is, to do taxes on tobacco and sugar and all of this. But again, like I said, these corporations can be very powerful in developing countries, that they're able to thwart some of these regulatory procedures. Now, because I talked about one of the fundamental pillars of the SDG is to leave no one behind. Okay, we all know this. But when you say we don't want to leave anybody behind in trying to implement the SDGs, we are indirectly saying that health is the public good, okay? Because if something is the public good, what it means is that everybody is able to consume that good, okay? And it doesn't get exhausted. So it doesn't exclude anybody when you categorize something as a public good, okay? Say, for instance, treatment for COVID, vaccines. Let's use that example. So here we are. We have a virus that has shut down the entire world. It's very infectious. It's crossing national boundaries. And then there are vaccines available to address that. So if we say that health is a public good, and we shouldn't leave anyone behind in the context of the SDG, then it means that there should be no rivalry in consuming that good, and that good should not exclude anybody. Okay, so Mr. A in the US, Mr. B in Uganda, Miss C in South Africa is able to consume that good, and there's still enough to go around. Okay, so we don't exclude anybody on the basis of their socioeconomic status, gender, or any other background. But also, there's no rivalry in consuming that good. Because when there's rivalry in consuming that good, then it's not enough to go around. That's why you have rivalry. So the public goods should be available. They should be sufficient for everybody that needs that to consume that without excluding anybody. So that's the thinking that comes when we say we're leaving no one behind. That automatically we have to ask this question. So therefore, is health now a public good? There are no easy answers to this. These ideas have been around, the idea of public goods. But if you put that in the context of global health, the question remains, who is going to finance the provision and financing of that public goods? $1 million question, because for instance, in the context of the vaccine, the pharmaceutical industry will argue that they've put in so much money in research and development. So if they succeed in inventing a vaccine or any drugs, they have to put their patent to recoup their profits. Okay, so those are the very controversial questions that we need to. So so it's just a question whether we should treat health or indeed any of the 17 SDGs as a public good, since we are talking about leaving no one behind. Okay. There are two important books that came out in the 90s, really, but they are still very, very, if you want to have a background reading on public goods. These two books from the UNDP actually did a lot of very interesting analysis covering a whole range of issues from health to peace to climate, all of these things. So if you're interested in understanding the concept of public goods in the international system and how to provide them, the controversies, you can search up these two books, and look at them. Now, because I promised you that I was going to talk about COVID, about vaccine, I think I promised that last week. So I want us to use the last 15 minutes to quickly look at, this very important thing that has changed our lives, challenged us in different ways for the past 2.5 years. So in terms of framing, it's good. I want us to understand, that in a globalized world that we live in, the so-called interdependent world, disease pathogens travel as fast as a jet. Okay, and global travel in our time is unparalleled in human history. In 1993, it was estimated that 500 million people crossed international borders on board the aircraft alone. So this excludes land crossings. If you look at the crossings, for instance, in a place like Europe, the entire the EU zone, people just cross the boundaries every day, driving from one country to another. One of the longest borders in the world, the US-Canada border, hundreds of thousands of people cross, between the two countries every single day. But so this number, this estimated 500 million people that cross international borders are just those that crossed on board the aircraft. Today, it is estimated to be above 1 billion. And as the US CDC, Centers for Disease Control, has argued, with 1 billion people crossing international borders each year, there's nowhere in the world from which we are remote, and no one from whom we are disconnected. That's just the reality of the world we live in. So over 1 billion tourists, traveled internationally in 2012, according to the UN World Tourism Organization. These are those that traveled for tourism, okay? And this is estimated to hit 1.8 billion in 2030, at the time we come to the end of the SDG. By 2030, 1.8 billion, averaging 5 million people crossing international borders every single day. Okay? So travel contributed to the transnational spread of Ebola in West Africa. We know what happened in Lagos, the guy who traveled from Liberia, to Lagos and all of that. SARS, that moved from Asia to Toronto in 2002. Tuberculosis, influenza, plague, cholera, and then now COVID-19. Okay, so each of these, or each of these imaginary imagined infectious diseases, travel, contributed, to their spread. And you can see this picture. People are moving. Some are refugees. Some are, crossing by border. Some are going by, by boat and going by sea. Some are flying. So people are on the move, either because of crisis, natural disasters, wars and conflicts, those traveling normally for vacation and things like that. So the most important is that people are crossing boundaries. And as they do that, what we now witness is what some scholars have called microbial unification of the world. Okay, the world has shrunk. Infectious diseases do not carry national passports. Just like, you travel to a country and you show your passport at the port of entry. Disease pathogens don't respect the national boundaries of states. They travel almost as fast as a jet, because of the jet age we live in. And state sovereignty is an alien concept in the microbial world. So we've really become a single gem pool, as the former DG of the World Health Organization, Gro Harlem Brundtland, argued that today, in an interconnected world, bacteria and viruses travel almost as fast as email and financial flows. Okay, I can't agree more, with Dr. Brundtland on this. With globalization, a single microbial sea washes all of humanity. There are no more health sanctuaries. with millions of people crossing international borders every single day. In the context of COVID, she argues that COVID-19 shines a light on our common humanity and shared vulnerabilities. Okay, we need an effective, in an interconnected world of today, we need an effective multilateral system, to address some of these emerging and reimagined global health issues. So, thank God for COVID. I hope you will be able to learn some lessons from this. But in the context of what COVID has done, if you put it, a bit broader, there's now a lot of studies that that came out from early 2001, early 2000, showing that there's now a reverse of progress made in the reduction of extreme poverty in so many countries. Simply because COVID, the pandemic, combined with the climate crisis, we still have a crisis of climate change, and the crippling debt, debt burdens of so many developing countries. So this has now led to an unprecedented increase in poverty. So the gains, no matter the little gains made by countries, so some countries, the progress made towards reducing extreme poverty, that's SDG 1, has now been reversed because of a combination of the pandemic, the climate crisis, and the crippling debt burdens. So in the context of that, for instance, access and affordability of vaccines in all countries, from an ethical perspective, it was argued, before those vaccines were made, that should COVID-19 vaccines be subject to strict patent protection? This is the point I was trying to make, pharmaceutical patents. Or should they be categorized as a global public good to be made available to vulnerable people that need them the most? So, for instance, the health, workforce, nurses, in so many countries who have to be in the front lines working. So these are ethical dilemmas, and the big pharmaceutical companies will always argue that they've invested a lot in research and development, in the cost of, the cost of producing these vaccines. Therefore, they have to recoup their costs, after they are made. So we had this very, terrible situation in the first 6 months that those vaccines were being used. And then it prompted the DG of the World Health Organization, Tedros Ghebreyesus, to publish this opinion in Foreign Policy in February 2021, where he argued that despite the growing number of vaccine options, current manufacturing capacity meets only one fraction of the global need. Vaccines are the best chance of bringing the pandemic under control, unless we succumb to what he calls vaccine nationalism. And we saw that, play out in Europe, play out in Canada, play out in the US, where the so-called, vaccine, some people call it vaccine protectionism, some call it vaccine nationalism, some call it vaccine apartheid, where some of these countries were hoarding vaccines. They wanted to vaccinate their populations and achieve herd immunity before releasing those vaccines to populations in need in developing countries. The COVAX frameworks came up, and that was a package that the WHO put together. It was the vaccine pillar of access to COVID tools. And there's something that was called the access to COVID tools, ACT accelerator. But COVAX was just the vaccine pillar of that. So it was led by a coalition of epidemic preparedness and innovation, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, WHO and UNICEF. And the aim was to accelerate the development and manufacture of COVID-19 vaccines and to guarantee fair and equitable access to most of the developing countries. There's a link that I put in there. So if you want to, learn more about this, you can, look at the WHO link on COVAX. But it was just a framework that was put together in a nutshell, to stockpile vaccines, based on donations that WHO has called for, and try to make these vaccines available to the countries in need. But as Dr. Tedros argues, as at end of 2021, COVAX was even struggling to purchase enough doses to cover just 20% of the population of the lower income countries by the end of last year. So the lesson that to learn from all of this is that when you set up this kind of framework that is based on charity, based on aid, it will never be enough, because like I said, the game that the countries were playing, the nationalized countries were playing, was to stockpile vaccines and even vaccinate their populations 2 or 3 times to achieve herd immunity before thinking about donating those to COVAX, to developing countries. So in a letter of 2nd October 2020, India and South Africa asked the WTO, the World Trade Organization, to waive the rules to aid COVID-19 drug production. So they called on the World Trade Organization, which is where issues of patents relating to medicines are enforced. So the so-called trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, the TRIPS agreement. So these 2 countries, India and South Africa, commendably, that was commendable activism on their part, asked WTO to waive parts of the agreement, the TRIPS agreement, as the proposal read, as new diagnostics and therapeutics and vaccines for COVID-19 vaccine are developed, there are significant concerns over how this will be made available promptly in sufficient quantities and an affordable price to meet global demand. So, but as always, this was actually a proposal by India and South Africa in October 2020. And it took the whole of 2021, and it was just about 4 weeks ago that the WTO actually, adopted this, but a very watered down. They removed everything in that, and then it was just now they allowed those kind of waiver only for vaccines. So it didn't go far enough, and the European Union opposed that very, very strongly. Countries like Japan, South Korea opposed that. The US opposed initially, but when with the change of administration, Joe Biden's administration actually supported it. There are countries like Canada that actually sat on the fence. They were not, either for or against that. So you can see the kind of, policy that played out at the WTO on this the so-called TRIPS waiver discussion. This was some of the work I did for the G20. I did with some of my colleagues, and it talks about, the significance of global public goods for health. So if you're interested, there's also a link. You can read that. So these are the, we try to propose equitable approaches to COVID-19 and future shocks, because we are looking at the future. I mean, there's, after when eventually we deal with COVID, something else is going to emerge, someday. It's just a question of time. Okay, so these are proposals that were made early on in the middle of the crisis. At that time, there was no vaccine, so the elders, which is a group of eminent leaders, world leaders, that was put together by Nelson Mandela and Kofi Annan. It has continued to be active, so it's called the elders. So they made this call, and this call was actually made to the G20, calling on them to commit about $8 billion, towards, strengthening the WHO, producing vaccines, and then also therapeutics. So this was the only way that the world was going to meet, to address the crisis of COVID. So this was a call they made in 2020. So this is the elders. You can see some of their faces. You see the former Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, Mary Robinson, former President of Ireland, who is now the president of the elders. Gresham Machel and Gro Harlem Brundtland. I've just quoted there, the former Prime Minister of Norway. So these are the the elders that I talked about. Now I'm coming to an end. I think I have 2 more slides. I wanted to share this in the context of the point I made about the reversal in progress that is made on poverty eradication in some developing countries because of COVID. So this is a report that came out from Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation in Uppsala in Sweden. By the way, they are very, very, very active. Dag Hammarskjöld, we know, was one of the past Secretary General of the UN, the second UN Secretary General. So in his honor, he died in a plane crash while on peace, diplomacy in the Congo in the 70s. So there's a foundation named in his honor in Uppsala, where he was born in Sweden, and they focus on UN issues. So they're very good. So they always come up with this kind of studies on how to make the UN better. So in the context of this crisis that COVID pushed so many countries, so they published this report where they were talking about the funding compact. So in a nutshell, they looked at the major UN appeals and trust funds with respect to COVID, and they argue that they make analysis. They looked at so many countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia Pacific, Latin America, and the Middle East. The most important thing is to avoid duplication, okay? To make sure that COVID response issues are tailored into these major UN appeals and trust funds. Because when you have duplication, then there are so many funds coming in, and then there's no coordination. So that's what this is all about. But what I liked about this report is that if you have time to look at the case studies they did in different regions, you'll find the concrete proposals they made on the way forward. Always good to quote the Secretary General of the UN because he's at the helm of affairs, whether it's for climate crisis or for COVID. So he argues that we need to invest towards building sustainable and resilient pathways that enable us not only to beat COVID, but also the climate crisis, reduce inequality, eradicate hunger and poverty. So we need to create space for investments in recovery and the SDGs. And I totally agree with him because the pandemic has actually, as I argued, has led to a reversal of progress in so many countries. So in terms of the way forward, we have to look at the point I made from the beginning. We need to review the social determinants of health. So health is not just disease or infirmity, but social determinants that affect human health in different societies. And in doing this, we have to consider the benchmarks that are already existing, especially in some of the existing human rights treaty obligations. Some of us that come from very strong backgrounds in human rights, we know about some of these benchmarks. So we can use those benchmarks to look at also what is happening in the SDGs. Since we're talking about health today, we need to do a health impact assessment across all SDGs. That way that I showed you, if you put health at the center, then you can ask yourself, how does how do the other SDGs affect health, and vice versa. Okay, we can do that for the other goals as well. We need to go back a bit in history to revisit the socially ambitious definition of health in the WHO Constitution as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. We need to develop policy pathways towards financing and provision of aspects of health as a public good. I know there are challenges on this because of the private sector that has to produce these goods, and the fact that they are always profit-motivated, profit-oriented. But governments can work out partnerships, public-private partnerships to address aspects of health as a public good. Effective regulation of the private sector interests. I've mentioned that, whether it's for patents, whether it's for food the food industry, the alcohol industry, and the other, tobacco, for instance. SDG 3 and the 2030 agenda need to build synergies, existing human rights obligations, norms, and soft law mechanisms. There are tons and tons of this. The UN, the comments, general comments of the UN special rapporteurs on different aspects of human rights. That's the popular comment number 14 of the special rapporteur on right to health. So we have these comments and reports that are issued by the various UN special rapporteurs, on right to food, on right to education, and all of this. So they will have a way in also informing, how we can address some of the challenges in implementing the SDGs. In conclusion, this is the very last slide. I think I want to conclude by, reminding us of, the powerful message by Nobel laureate Joshua Lederberg, that the world is just one village. Our tolerance of disease in any place in the world is at our own peril. And Paul Forman argues that anyone who wishes to be considered human has ample cause to consider what it means to be sick and poor in the era of globalization and scientific advancement. So that's it from me. I hope we can have at least 10 to 20 minutes of discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Obi. So as we finished right on time, so we are now open for taking questions and any clarifications if somebody asks. You can use the chat function, or you can come on the screen and ask your question. Just one suggestion, please, keep your questions short so that we can include more and more questions and queries that can be clarified. So yeah, please go ahead. You can use the raise hand function and I'll give the floor to you.
Hi, I'm sorry, I can't, I don't know how to raise my hand. I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
Sorry, so it's Kinga from Mauritania. Thank you very much, Dr. Obi. I missed a slide. I mean, you were talking about creating space. I think it's one of the last slides, and I just wanted to know, I mean, I could see how the recommendations could link to that, but could you elaborate a little bit on this? Concretely speaking, how could we do that in the field? I'm sorry, it's a big question, but it's
so creating space, creating space for what? No, creating space for what? Because I said,
sorry, yeah. You've in your yeah, in the last slides, okay, yeah. I'm trying to remember creating. I think it's creating space to. It wasn't about partnership, right? If you can go back, I can.
I think I stopped sharing, but.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, but okay. Well, how is it about the private sector?
So my question, was it only about that, or because I could see a lot of link on yeah, sorry.
Okay, no, that's fine.
I'll elaborate.
We have to, yeah, we have to. So the very last.
Okay, so the very last, and you said I agree with this statement.
Okay, that was the statement from the SG.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And
okay, yeah.
Oh, yeah. There we are. I think so.
Okay. No, I know what you mean. Yeah, this one.
Yes, we need to create for investment, and then yes, and the sustainable. So my interest is creating space for investment with the sustainable development goals, and I could see in the recommendation that there's a link on this notion of creating space. But if you can elaborate a little bit on that.
Okay, there are so many ways it could be done. I think that comment he made it. No, he made it in the context of the point that I made that based on studies coming out from different countries, that progress that has been made on eradication of extreme poverty is now being reversed or has now been reversed. Okay, so there are a few countries, whether developing, whether least developed, that have made progress on SDG 1 prior to COVID. Okay, so when COVID hits, it reversed that progress. And it's not just COVID, but COVID combining with the climate crisis. Okay, so if a country had, say, for instance, we're talking about poor countries. So if you budgeted, I'm giving an example since we talked about concrete examples. So if a country budgeted, say, $1 million, let's do that example, for mitigation, climate mitigation, for instance, and then because of COVID, is now forced to, what COVID did in so many countries, it's now forced to channel funds, to address COVID. And because of that, that climate mitigation suffers because they have to move funds. COVID was an infectious disease. It was a virus that was attacking, the highly infectious. So countries were, scrambling to address that. So if you move funds that way, that climate crisis has to wait because you can deal with it, maybe tomorrow or 6 months time, or when COVID ends. But the issue at hand now is to address, COVID. So there are so many countries that have put money in, apart from climate issues, but also in poverty eradication. And the COVID actually forced them to move these funds, out of those programs. So that's what that study is all about. If you go back and read that, I'll give you the slides. If you go back and read that study, there are so many, and the Dag Hammarskjöld study as well, the one from Sweden. All of these, they point to, there are concrete case studies that you look at, where countries have moved resources away from poverty eradication or climate issues in order to address COVID. Okay. So that has complicated. So what the Secretary General is saying is that we need to reinvest. Okay, we need to reinvest on those. The climate crisis. If you read his comments, it's very clear. The impact of COVID on climate crisis and poverty eradication. So we need to reinvest, create the space to reinvest on those issues. That's what he's saying. So in terms of the practical ways to do that, I think the report by the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation gave those destiny. Remember that the UN, I'm talking about the UN actually as an institution, launched. There are 3 major funds to address COVID issues. So the argument is that we should be very careful not to duplicate funds. So why don't we channel COVID response issues, within these funds? And this is the work that the UN resident coordinators have to do in every country. That's what they do actually. That's their job. So they look at the funds coming in, and then they have to address, how, to use them, how to channel them into, existing programs in order to first, yes, address COVID, but also not to duplicate too much, into doing different things at the same time. So it's about alignment, aligning, those resources that are coming from those 3 major UN funds. So that's what I understand by that.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks.
We have one hand from Penny. Yep, Penny, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a 2-part question that I'll try to keep short. So as we know, the COVID vaccine distribution saw a lot of issues and inequity despite the calls for global unity, which of course affected many people disproportionately. And there were issues with the state-centric approaches that I believe favored many of the wealthier nations that could afford to buy more vaccines and technology. In the event that COVID-19 escalates further and requires more measures taken, or a new pandemic strikes in the coming years, causing another public health crisis, what can be done differently by the institutions to ensure equity in the distributions of vaccines or medication? And do you think that there's anything that could incentivize developed countries to recognize vaccines as a global public good and in a future crisis, share resources and technologies equitably?
Yes, that's a very, very interesting question. The 2 questions actually. In terms of let me start with the first, what can be done differently in terms to ensure vaccine equity. I'll give you an example of what has happened in terms of lessons learned. In Africa, for instance, there was something that was put up. By the way, let me say that I've worked in the field of global health and international development for some years now, and I get frustrated, that we never learn lessons. Okay, whether it's from HIV, AIDS pandemic, whether it's on Ebola and all of this. So these things happen, and we talk about it. We're in a crisis mode. Everybody talks about it, and then once it's we go back to business as usual. But COVID, after Ebola, the African countries, the African Union, put together what they call the Africa Center for CDC, for Africa Center for Disease Control and Prevention, as a health agency of the African Union. It's based in Addis Ababa. And it was partly because of the lessons from Ebola, okay? Ebola in DRC, Ebola in the 3 West African countries. There's a limit to what happens when you fold your hands and wait for the so-called international community to come and solve your problems, okay? So when they put that, and by the way, is one of the things that the African Union has done very well, which I give them, I give them kudos for. So when they put together the Africa Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the Africa CDC is called. What happened during the pandemic was quite lessons not learned from Ebola from these past pandemics. Take vaccine, the Omicron, for instance. Let's just talk about practical things here. When the vaccines were made, first Pfizer, Moderna, these are the first 2, and then the AstraZeneca. But those first 2 or those first 3 major vaccines, when they were produced, before the production, before the testing and certification, most countries have put in orders in advance. And we find that if that was actually the point that Dr. Tedros was talking about in that piece that I put on my slides. Eventually, the European countries, the US, Canada, these 3 countries especially, and the UK, stockpiled those vaccines, and they were waiting to vaccinate their populations before making them available. So there's a case involving Botswana. It's not about poverty, it's not about money. Botswana actually paid ahead, requested for those vaccines. They paid to Pfizer, but Pfizer couldn't deliver them, because there was a shortage. And then at that point, they were waiting for months, waiting for Pfizer to deliver, their destiny. And that's when the Omicron, occurred, the mutation that supposedly the world told us, occurred in South Africa. Now, when you live in a world that is, characterized by this kind of inequities, especially for something that is life-threatening, okay, it raises a lot of, let me say, moral questions. And what the Africa CDC has done was to aggressively pursue, the development of, vaccine production facilities in Africa. Not just for COVID, but they're looking ahead, so that when this kind of thing happens again, you don't have to, line up and start waiting for, the vaccines to be given to you from other countries. So you have the facility to actually produce your own vaccine. Cuba did it, as tiny as Cuba is, Cuba did it within a record time. So the capacity has to be there, so that you can now adapt to imagine and reimagine, global issues. So that raises the question that the second part of your question, whether lessons have been learned, and how can these can global public goods be part of this equation in the future? It is just about empathy. I've been in so many meetings, both UN and non-UN forums, where all of these things are discussed, and we agree that if you live in an interdependent world, in a global interdependent world, where the health of nations or the health of everybody is kind of interlinked with all of these things about travel and all of that. So we can't build sanctuaries. I think I made that point very strongly. You can't build, fortify your boundaries and say, well, I'm in Canada, I'm in US, and therefore I'm insulated. So how do we actually ensure that we have empathy? Empathy means having, empathizing for lives, in whether they're in South America or whether they're in Asia, or whether they're in Europe. We're talking about human lives, okay? That's one thing. The other thing is, how can we, use enlightened self-interest, okay, in diplomacy, for instance. That's extremely important, because if you do that, it means that the reason why the US or Canada, for instance, would be interested, to help the Africa CDC develop this facility, is that if you don't do that, then in an interdependent world, if this things emerge and mutate, we're not safe in Canada. So doing that is not actually charity to Africa, for instance, or charity to South Asia, or charity to Latin America or the Caribbean. Doing that is actually helping us, because mutation has shown that, if with all these vaccinations that we have, two vaccines or 3 doses or whatever, if there's a mutation that actually, affects all that, it's back to square one. So the lesson to learn and the way to incentivize, the provision of public goods is to infuse some form of, enlightened self-interest. So doing that is not just charity, but doing that is actually, addressing dangers, or vulnerabilities that might come to hit us in Latin America, in Europe or North America. So that would be my response to that. So it's empathy for human lives everywhere.
Thank you, Professor, for the elaborate response. There's one question from Pranay. Are we back to normal post-COVID? How long mental health issues shall persist in global scenario, further getting momentum for SDGs?
Excellent question. Very, very excellent. I don't think we are back to normal post-COVID. If you look at, well, I'm in Canada. The numbers have been rising. There's a new variant from Omicron that is now the dominant variant, and most of the provinces are seriously rethinking bringing back mask mandates and all of that. So I looked at the numbers yesterday, and it's very worrisome what is happening now. So we're not yet out of the woods. Progress has been made because at least 85% or 90% have been fully vaccinated. So you may not see significant number of hospitalizations that might cripple the healthcare system, but you are going to see there's already a very rapid, significant rise in infections. So people will get it because now about 85% are fully vaccinated, and they will deal with it. So that's my take on the first part of the question. And the other one that you asked was what was the second? That was the second part of that question.
How long mental health issues shall?
Yes. So mental health issues. That's why I said it's an excellent question. Yes, unfortunately as well, I do, like I said, I do global health and international development. That's those are my areas of specialty. But unfortunately, I have to say that in all of this discussion, mental health is always not as conspicuous as I would want that to be. It's not very visible. We do know that COVID has really led to a whole lot of mental health issues globally. Amongst all age groups, young people are, suffering. There's all kinds of, depression, anxiety, on the part of everybody. Families have been torn apart. Old people isolated in, old people's homes. So these are serious mental health issues. And I think I would want to see in framing of policies, both within countries and internationally, to see a more conspicuous mental health approach in all of this. So thank you for raising that, and I agree with you that it's something that we need to think about very seriously.
There is another interesting question from Betru. Given the resource dimension of implementing the right to health and the anomaly of scarcity, do you believe the complete well-being of health can ever be achieved?
No, but this is one of the things that comes up when you talk about right to health. Nobody can guarantee you, absolute health. Okay, and if you look at the literature on global health, that's one of the criticisms of the WHO definition. So those who don't like it, they think it's too much. Health is not everything. Okay, so how can you talk about health being a state of complete social, economic, and physical well-being? So they have a problem with that. That school of thought. But as human beings, nobody can guarantee you perfect health. We're all born with all kinds of different genetic components, and some people have diseases that are hereditary, inherited from from their grandparents or their lineage and things like that. So so I think it's anomalous in a way to talk about complete health and well-being. That's not possible. We all have issues. So health can be relative. When somebody's healthy, is relative, speaking. But in the context of what is available, is about how can we maximize, the potentials, okay, of everybody's health. We do know that there are potentials we can target. There are potentials that we can reach if we have a good healthcare system. So it's a very complicated thing that talking about the health of people in different countries. Japan has the highest life expectancy in the world, and you see there are countries that have. So Japan may have about 80 or thereabouts, and then the same country, the same world, there are countries that have life expectancy of 45. So you have a huge, almost 50, 60-year difference, between the two. So it means that, automatically, if somebody is born, a baby is born in Japan today, and the baby is born in Haiti, okay, or in Uganda, these are 3 babies born in 3 different countries. They didn't choose where to be born, okay? They were born there because their parents are from there. Automatically, the baby that is born in Japan, you can easily say that he has chances of living 40 or 45 or 50 more years, more than the baby that was born in Haiti, the same day. So that's what complicates, this kind of analysis. So right to health or universal health coverage or complete well-being depends a lot on the environment where we live or where we are born. Okay, it's not just the healthcare setting being so good, but also the environment. If you think about the social determinants of health. So yes, money is important, like you said, scarcity of resources, but then money is not everything. Okay, we need to think about that in the context of. So it's good to do this kind of cross-cultural comparisons. I know there was a time that WHO published, they did a comparison of the health systems in the world, and it became so controversial because they ranked Haiti better than the US. Sorry, they ranked Cuba better than the US, ahead of the US in terms of healthcare. So that's possible, but so we should avoid those kind of comparisons. I think it's a progressive realization of the health indicators And some countries have made really very good progress. You know, actually the upper middle income countries, you know, countries like Malaysia, you know, Thailand, you know, they've actually made very good progress, given all the indicators. You know, reducing maternal health, infant mortality, and all of that. Those can be measured, okay? And so that tells you whether you're making progress or not. So that's my response to that.
Thank you, Professor. I think we have time for at least one more question, if anybody wants to jump in. Else we'll call it a day.
Okay, I just checked. There's no more question in the chat box.
Okay, so I think we are good for today. Professor Obi, do you want to give some closing remarks or anything?
And no, I think I will, what I will do, I will get into the class forum, the discussion forum, online forum. And then please, you know, if you have any questions, please, you can raise them there as well. I will be available to, you know, to look at those questions and the comments this week. I wish you every success in the weeks ahead. I think the thing about this course is the fact that you know, a combination of academic and, you know, practical side of things that gives you some of the tools that you need. I hope you enjoy it more than better, as you know, as well as the previous cohorts. We've received very, you know, very positive feedbacks over the years, you know, from the participants. So I hope, you know, you're enjoying it, and if you have any questions apart from the class discussion forum, you can also send me personal emails. I'm very happy to respond. You know, my email is on the slides. So send me personal emails, and I will, if there's anything that you want us to, you know, to discuss further that I raised last week or this week, I'm very, very happy to explore that, you know, with you personally over email. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure meeting you virtually, and I hope we will stay in touch in the weeks or years or months ahead. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Obi, and thank you, everyone. See you for the next sessions. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.